Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, especially on such a sunny day. And thank you for joining us tonight for the launch of the Empire Remains shop. This is Cooking Section's first book, and it was just published by Columbia Books on Architecture and the City. Tonight's evening will begin with a response to the book by Natasha Ginwala, and then Cooking Section's Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alon Schwabe will give a lecture performance titled The Next Invasive is Native. That will be followed by a presentation by Coco Fusco and a discussion about the remains of empire. And lastly, Alan and Daniel will be serving a special cocktail that some of you have already seen in the back in preparation, that they call the plant that could sink your mortgage. I'd like to welcome the editor, Jesse Konuk, to tell you more about this lovely book, and thank you all for coming, and please give a warm welcome.
So I just want to thank you again for coming. We're really excited to finally launch the Empire Remains shop, the book. As a sort of introduction, I'm here to tell you a bit more about the book before we dive into some of the specifics. Before it was a book, the Empire Remains shop was an actual shop of sorts at 91 to 93 Baker Street in London. Open for most of the fall of 2016, it attempted to sell back the remains of the British Empire to the London public. The Empire Remains shop riffs on the never-opened empire shops proposed by the British government's Empire Marketing Board in the 1920s. The shops were intended to introduce and familiarize the fruits of empire to the residents of the British Isles. Likewise, the Empire Remains shop offered a program of discussions, performances, dinners, installations, and screenings to remind and familiarize contemporary Britain with the ways that empire persists today. The book proposes the further development of that project. Rather than simply catalog and record the work of the shop, this version of the Empire Remains shop proposes an expansion of the project, laying out a selection of themes and ideas that can be addressed in future iterations of the shop. Pre-wrapped in a franchise agreement, the book offers a sort of manual for the exploration of the many other empires and the many other ways those empires continue to be powerful today. There are many people participating in the event this evening. Cooking Sections, Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alon Schwabe, is a duo of spatial practitioners based out of London. It was born to explore the systems that organize the world through food. Using installation, performance, mapping, and video, their research-based practice explores the overlapping boundaries between visual arts, architecture, and geopolitics. Coco Fusco is an interdisciplinary artist and writer, and the Andrew Banks Endowed Professor, we're missing. At the University of Florida. Her work has been presented at the 56th Venice Biennale, 2 Whitney Biennials, BAM's Next Wave Festival, the Sydney Biennial, the Johannes Biennial, and very many other biennials. She is represented by Alexander Gray Associates in New York. Natasha Ginwala is a curator and writer. She curated Contour Biennial 8, Polyphonic Worlds, Justice as Medium, and was curatorial advisor for Documenta 14 in 2017. Ginwala writes on contemporary art and visual culture in various periodicals and has contributed to numerous publications. This spring, she joins as curator at the Gropius Bau in Berlin. And Natasha will come up now.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jesse. I'm extremely enthusiastic and maybe overly excited about the launch of this book. I was one of those people who didn't make it into the book because I couldn't stick to the efficiency of this amazing editor and artist duo, so they sort of really wrapped this up in the span of a year, and it's incredible how 3 years of process and an entire community has built around the Empire Remains shop. So if some of you have already seen the book, when you hold this book in your hands, you will encounter an invitation that is legally binding, a way of entrance into worlding that is The Empire Remains shop, which must at first be navigated through a partnership agreement and the licensing of not only a concept in artistic terms, but rather an operative model, an enterprise with many heads. Let me address this project in 3 moves, and this will be wrapped up in 10 minutes somehow. Fluctuation, indebtedness, and agonistic repetition. The Empire Remains shop brings into play, as David Harvey terms, the geographic imperative of capital. At the heart of this initiative is not a tokenistic examination of the Empire Marketing Board and its exploits through network circulation and transplantation of foodstuff, but rather the formation of active responses towards histories around the manufacture of global cuisine, imperial advertising, a necropolitics of hunger, the toxicity of grains and terrains, and moreover, the ways the taste of empire marks our consumption patterns today and possibly also in the future. Fluctuation. So this work, Today We Are Green, is essentially a rum and ethanol fountain that alternately gives away one or the other according to the daily rates of the oil price and the NASDAQ stock market index. This came about through research that Daniel and Alan were doing in Barbados, but also looking at the history of the sugar trade and plantation labor. So what you have is essentially a rum-ethanol combination that is also the nexus of life and non-life. How do we acclimatize within the shop to this fluctuation between food and fuel? Indebtedness. Encounters with the Empire Remains shop urged me to consider how the ultimate remains of coloniality's time are the scars and the yoke of indebtedness of the colonized subject. These further affirmed and consolidated as neoliberal financialization's insatiable debt credit trap that has us all ensnared. Within the e-flux journal in March 2010 issue, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten write in Debt and Study, and I quote, "But our debts stay bad. We keep buying another song, another round. It is not credit that we seek, nor even debt, but bad debt, which is to say real debt, the debt that cannot be repaid, the debt at a distance, the debt without creditor, the black debt, the queer debt, the criminal debt, excessive debt, incalculable debt, debt for no reason, debt broken from credit, debt as its own principle." Within the introduction, Alan and Daniel talk about how these essays and interventions are deployed in the unmaking of the invention of the exotic, treating the tropical not as tame through the disciplinary annihilation techniques of empire, but through its innate wildness and through the potentiality of its excess. The remainder that is here being returned to the source, that is the British Empire, is therein a rebellious means to tackle what is construed as incessant insufficiency and incalculability in relation to debt, but here turning into radical produce. Such an example is also the cases of confusion work that they present within this space and within also the Contour Biennial in which they participated. The history of this work, I can't go into a lot of detail, but it essentially starts with the story of a gardener who became the sort of architect, one of the many architects of the British Empire and banana trade from to the rest of the world from Britain in the early 19th century, Joseph Paxton. He encounters the banana plant in the Duke of Cavendish's Devonshire estate. And from there, and from those glass houses, what you see are the Wardian cases that make the banana plant trap it into a sort of portable device, and within highly controlled measures from which it is traveling overseas. It then becomes another sort of model to colonize further variations of the banana plant until there is this monocropping that is another kind of creation of debt. Within the work, there is this sort of creation of these beautiful suitcases that can travel as hand luggage, that also resemble these glass cases and these controlled environments. And then in our case, within the progress of the biennial, the banana plant sort of takes a life of its own. So yeah, I really feel that sort of this work as well looks at the progress of indebtedness through what Harney calls the use of capital in its complete automation without the need for labor. There is this kind of automation and mobility of the plant. The third point that I want to make, in which I just want to talk about the franchise, is agonistic repetition. Working out terms of piracy through the franchise as a way of being in common. So the franchise is not only a floating signifier. And the Empire Remains shop is, in a sense, a planetary figure to participate in various eco-political struggles. In her foreword, Elizabeth Povinelli notes, while imperial proto and actual capitalist networks insist on things taking a specific form as the condition of their circulation, the network itself doesn't absorb the world without being affected by it. As a result, neither thing nor world can ever remain the same as the space is crisscrossed. Nothing is sovereign in itself or in its movement. And I end. The franchise, therefore, which I'm calling in shorthand a form of agonistic repetition, brings this fact into view of when you recreate the Empire shop in other parts of the world, but also in London in times of Brexit and far-right governance around the world. I see it as a kind of productive, cannibalizing process, in a kind of return to wildness, not as ghostly haunting, but as mutation of forms and as an ethical strategy. Let us not forget that the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, an early model of multinational corporation, instituted in its board of directors known as the Gentleman's 17, the founding charter that gave rights to build forts, maintain fleets, and engage in warfare. These activities were never considered separate, but rather inseparable from the operability of the early corporation. What this franchise therefore presents is going back to the original idea of the franchise, free from servitude, a kind of radical invitation, if we take it up, to understand and re-narrate the history of colonial marketing and the aesthetic life of the imperial corporation, indeed how to corrupt these entwined circuits from the inside. In the Empire Remains shop, Cooking Sections continues to think through these intrinsic linkages between labor and produce as an infrastructural unconscious, and as a result, manifesting collaborative methodologies in cultural practice that continually disrupt the supply chain. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. In July 2013, In the West Midlands, lab technician Kenneth McRae murdered his wife Jane before killing himself.
He went mad after finding out that Japanese knotweed was growing under his house.
It spread from the nearby golf course onto his property.
But no knotweed was found on the property after the fateful murder.
Last year, William Jones hanged himself after being notified that Japanese knotweed has been growing on his property.
Japanese knotweed, Falopia japonica, and other non-native species, including Himalayan balsam, Impatiens glandulifera, Rhododendron ponticum, and giant hogweed, Heracleum espondilium, have been at the forefront of a war against non-human invaders in Northern Europe, and especially in the UK.
They have been accused of taking over land,
Private property and public ground,
gardens and forests,
houses and factories,
highways and waterways.
any ways in which a plant can appear.
Long before people started to take their own life in their hands, the government has allocated enormous sums of money to try and solve the problem.
The problem, plants from elsewhere invade us here.
In preparation for the 2012 Olympic Games, £100 million were spent in clearing the Olympic grounds.
The total cost to the British taxpayer for fighting Japanese knotweed and other invaders is around £250 million per year.
It is estimated that the global expenditure on mitigation and eradication programs for invasive species has exceeded £1.8 trillion.
In the 2000s, Japanese knotweed transformed from a horticultural problem into a media event. Journals, newspapers, and tabloids all reported the Great Invasion.
They portrayed the environmental challenge in war paint. They declared battle to save the pure British landscape.
The garden invader that could sink your mortgage.
The invader. If it's in your garden, panic now.
At war with aliens.
Hidden threat.
Japanese knotweed invasion causes Herefordshire home price drop.
The plant that could cost you your home.
Not in my backyard.
Panic was not caused by the presence of Japanese knotweed. It was banks that made people panic. Any trace of knotweed on a property could result in the refusal of a mortgage. Real estate markets and property values are threatened by a plant.
A new industry of fear was born.
In the volcanic soils of Japan's mountainous regions, Japanese knotweed has flourished for centuries.
Poor soil, lava, and ash, all lacking the nutrients to support plant life.
Japanese knotweed thrives where only few can survive.
Volcanic landscapes share many similarities with urban wastelands.
Declining industrial ports and factories, forgotten dump sites, unused landfills, vacant roadsides, shrinking cities, train tracks.
Soils contaminated by lead, copper, iron, nickel, and sulfur are ideal seedbeds.
In landscapes where no one has ever planted anything, Japanese knotweed is one of the first plants to arrive.
Knotweed is a mere result of anthropogenic nature.
In the UK, the epicenter of the Japanese knotweed invasion is often located in Swansea, the knotweed jungle. The plant has existed in the city since the 1910s, but no one paid any notice to it until the 1970s, when it started appearing in gardens across town.
The uncontrolled growth of Japanese knotweed marked the decline of the copper mines and the cityscape's transformation into an industrial relic. Metal pollution in the soil and the multitude of abandoned spaces served as a comfortable ground for the spread of the plant.
Rapid urbanization moved tons of earth around the city, displacing, carrying, and spreading the plant's rhizomatic roots all over. Its spreads followed the rhythm of construction. It is possible to track the decay of industrial areas by looking at how knotweed has taken over the country. Japanese knotweed has been declared indisputably the UK's most aggressive, destructive, and invasive plants. Native,
Non-native.
native,
Non-native.
native,
Non-native.
native,
Non-native.
alien,
Exotic.
uncommon.
Invasive.
To know whether a species belongs to a place, we need to know the spatial boundaries to the area of which it belongs.
Or to which it does not belong.
Geopolitical boundaries should be enough to determine whether a species belongs to a specific nation state is native to that area. Nonetheless, changes and redefinitions of national boundaries clearly impact interpretations of native or non-native.
The separation of the former Czechoslovakia into the Czech and Slovak republics rearranged the species that are native to one side or the other.
The reunification of East and West Germany recombined the native species of both sides, rendering former aliens into natives.
We need to determine the time an alien plant arrived or when it became naturalized. The amount of years that a species has inhabited a certain place should be enough to determine its degree of belonging.
But what is the threshold?
3 years?
30 years?
300 years?
3,000 years?
30,000 years.
Over the past 2 centuries, the planet has experienced an incomparable movement of species around the globe. If we were to consider a longer-term perspective, most native flora could actually be seen as alien invaders. Space has been engineered and constructed through a movement of species and the fears of its fecundity.
4 tipping points define the degree of nativeness of native plants in the UK.
Tipping point number 1. The sea splits Britain off the European continent 7,000 to 8,000 years ago.
After this geological event, a native plant would be one that arrived in Britain prior to Britain becoming an island. Aliens are all those that arrived afterwards.
Tipping point number 2. The Romans and Normans arrive in the British Islands, the first 1,000 years after Christ.
Both brought with them huge numbers of animals, plants, and herbs from southern Europe and the Mediterranean. Many of these species are keystones of British ecology: humble rabbit, fallow deer, brown hare, and even nettles.
Many of these species have been absorbed into the native ecology. Most are now tolerated, celebrated, and preserved. They have become an intimate part of what we know and see as British ecology.
Tipping point number 3, Europe lands in America.
Christopher Columbus's arrival in America in 1492 marked the beginning of an epoch of mass death. An estimated 50 million inhabitants of North, Central, and South America died between his landing and the mid-17th century from warfare, enslavement, and the rapid spread of European disease.
The trouble of profitable species across the globe followed, escalating to an unprecedented scale. Marked by the wave of European settlement in the Americas, non-native plants became classified as neophytes, plants that arrived after Christopher Columbus, and archaeophytes, the ones that were already there.
According to this formula, potatoes and tomatoes are aliens on the European continent.
Tipping point number 4, iron and glass helps species travel.
Japanese knotweed arrived in Europe from Japan with Bavarian doctor Philipp Franz von Siebold as an exotic treat for his garden.
August 9, 1850 is the date logged for the arrival of Japanese knotweed in Britain according to the Kew Gardens record of traveling species. After that, it quickly became commercially available for the first time.
Benefiting from its exotic origin, knotweed became a novelty plant and enjoyed special promotion from William Robinson. Leader of the wild English garden movement, Robinson rebelled against military-ordered flower patches and colors.
He promoted a more natural-looking form of landscape and gardening, a fabricated wilderness, a chaotic man-made garden that looks as if it had been designed by nature itself.
In Britain, it was landowners with a desire to add variety and curiosity to their estates who introduced alien species to their semi-public gardens. Rhododendron, Japanese knotweed, mandarin ducks, Canadian geese, gray squirrels, and little owls.
Empire redesigned the wild.
The movement of natives and non-native plants around the world relied on Wardian cases, glass boxes that created controlled environments with designated humidity, temperature, sunlight and levels during the voyage.
These boxes set the precedent for new architectural typologies: glass houses, hothouses, greenhouses, botanical gardens, and exhibition halls, where plants would arrive, acclimatize, be reproduced, and leave again for a different part of the world.
None of these four tipping points of globalization offer a clear definition of the native or the alien. On the contrary, each constructs space anew and blurs those thresholds even further.
The preference for biodiversity over bio-uniformity is a cultural construct of recent times. The preference for biodiversity and the notion that alien species are enemies of biodiversity are relatively modern ideas.
More than the definition of native and non-native is challenging, the belief in the alien as a negative agent plays a crucial role in that distinction.
And although we are talking about plants and animals, the language that stems from the same language stems out of discourses on human migration.
The right to travel and settle in Britain was exercised freely until the end of the 19th century.
Passports were introduced in 1858, but they were more a matter of convenience for those traveling abroad rather than a means of population control.
There was little control over new immigrants settling in the British Isles. With the massive immigration from Eastern Europe during the 1890s, things started to change. Racism and xenophobia became more and more common with the 1905 Aliens Act, which created immigration quotas for the first time.
And residents of turn-of-the-century London began to complain about exotic Japanese nutwit invading their property right around the same time.
The invention of passports at first testified the opportunity to travel.
But in what may be a coincidence, a year after the introduction of British passports, the British Acclimatization Society was also established. Its goal was to enrich the fauna and flora of the colonies, but more importantly, to acclimatize foreign species to the local context and economy of Britain, to tame them into their new home and impose a new environment on them.
The invasion paradigm was born out of the two phenomena: the deliberate introduction of exotic plants and animals by the Victorian acclimatization societies and the wild garden movement.
Both anticipated many of the challenges that conservation and ecology face today. Ecologist Charles Elton's post-World War II writing on invasive species was critical on this issue. Before the war, he promoted exotic species, but during World War II, he worked as part of the team fighting the impact of foreign pests and diseases on wartime agriculture Britain.
Elton shifted his practice from welcoming exotic plants to promoting botanical nationalism. Yet, non-native plants and animals are everywhere in attempts to fortify a national landscape.
Figs were brought to Sheffield to relieve Victorian citizens from endemic constipation. But sewage washed the seeds downriver. Rooting on riverbanks and heated by runoff from factories and steel plants, the fig seeds believed they were on Mediterranean ground. And today, they are part of the cultural heritage of the city.
Red grouse is an icon of Scotch whisky. Its connection to British culture heritage encourages policies that benefit this particular species over others. It has promoted system of drainage and burning that result in monoculture fields of heather in Scotland, a culturally imposed landscape modification, one that serves an economic purpose.
On March 23, 2006, the British Parliament hosted the Red Squirrel debate. The matter at hand was the protection of the native and cute red squirrel, a key character of children's books, over the dreadful gray squirrel from America, which has been threatening the local red squirrels for years.
Nonetheless, this native red squirrel was formerly considered a pest. became extinct, and then was later reintroduced from Scandinavia. Genetically, the native red squirrel is not native.
Nettles have been invasive for hundreds of years, but no alarm has spread in the media as they are seen as native.
Exotic conifers planted by the timber industry are destroying native forests, but they are economically practical.
The Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981 began regulating the release of non-native species in the wild.
The Environmental Protection Act of 1990 classed Japanese knotweed as a controlled waste and required that it be disposed of safely at licensed landfill sites.
Scotland's Wildlife and Natural Environment Act of 2011 made spreading invasive plants a criminal activity.
The Infrastructure Act of 2015 allows access to private land for the purpose of eradicating invasive plants and alien species.
Horror weed on rampage. It consumes everything in its path, and cutting it back only makes it more aggressive.
The plant that ate Britain. Invasion of the killer weeds.
One article includes an image with a shoot coming through the floor.
The photo is credited to Japanese Knotweed Solutions Limited, a company that provides Japanese knotweed eradication services.
Searching online for Japanese knotweed, we find the same image, but slightly altered. Both images capture the same corner of a room and what appears to be a shoot of knotweed lifting the floorboards. But the color palette is different. In one, the colors are intensified, and in the other, they are a bit duller. But the two images are also cropped differently. The one published in the magazine avoids the piece of laminate floor moved aside for the picture. On the left, it looks as if the plant is lifting a heavy wooden floor and exposing the insulation. On the right, we see how the floor is not proper wood, but very thin laminate, and that someone has intervened to exaggerate the impact of the growing plant.
As part of the marketing strategy, Japanese Knotweed Solutions Limited also created extensive marketing campaigns that even included sci-fi posters for apocalyptic movies. The UK most invasive weed is waiting. Week 1, regeneration. Week 3, new shoots. Week 8, rapid growth. Week 28, devastation. 28 weeks later. Japanese knotweed, a nightmare on your streets. Don't get caught by the undead. Knotweed is lying dormant and waiting to reemerge. The fight goes on.
The majority of these images circulating online show how Japanese knotweed is not just a plant. It is a plant in a crack in the concrete. And that is the contemporary botanical image, punctuated with fear. But is there a real threat? Can Japanese knotweed penetrate a 30 centimeter slab of concrete? Is Japanese knotweed really strong enough to crack concrete, or did it merely grow in the crack like any other plant?
Following Lorraine Dustin and Peter Gallison's idea of objectivity, the botanical image is a means of production of truth.
18th century atlas illustrators defined the image of a plant, and they decided what makes the perfect image of the plant. The ideal, the average, the normal, Goethe's Urpflanze. But that plant is so idealized that it does not exist. It carries features of many specimens put together in an impossibly true way. The botanical drawing distributes only certain kinds of knowledge.
Botanical drawings overlap different times simultaneously. They represent growth and death, blossoming and decay. The spaces of nature are tamed at a pictorial level.
The image of a plant registers the many interests around it, either for scientific or economic purposes. Today, the image of the cracked concrete and its architectural implications are inseparable from the plant itself.
Japanese knotweed and other invasive plants have become anthropogenic species, yet scientists and policymakers still try to control their spread. Over the last decade, researchers and companies have tried to kill the plant with pesticides, glyphosides, injections, even by introducing biological control measures in the form of goats or insects that eat the plant. None have so far achieved their goal.
It is true that knotweed can grow through a gap in concrete or the gap between brickwork and concrete, but so can many other plants. Repetition of this claim does not make it any more true, but it does create a market for expensive eradication programs.
Apart from Japanese Knotweed Solutions Limited, other companies also provide eradication services. In the elaborate reports that real estate agents and credit institutions provide for their customers, they perpetuate the scaremongering.
And as Eco-Control Solutions claimed, during the survey, it was noted that there was a significant infestation of mature and healthy Japanese knotweed, a structurally damaging plant able to penetrate a range of surfaces and structures. Planning permission and many mortgages are declined due to the incidence of uncontrolled Japanese knotweed in or close to subject properties.
As we see here, their language insists on toxicity and contamination to stress the urgency of eliminating the plant. It is essential to eradicate all of the infestations, otherwise the client site will be recontaminated in the near future.
They also borrowed terms of military intervention. We have an operative in your area on Monday, the 11th of August, and are inquiring as to whether you need another knotweed treatment.
Companies providing eradication services emphasize the responsibility of the owner. The legislation above puts a duty of care on the landowner with Japanese knotweed infestation, who is obligated to be proactive in the control and eradication of it.
New regulations, heavily influenced by the ongoing scaremongering, are turning that proactiveness into a legal obligation. Indeed, failing to control Japanese knotweed on one's property can result in an antisocial behavior order and a fine up to £2,500.
The next invasive is native started as a way to rethink the alien as an entity that actually constructs a new reality and brings valuable hybridization. As part of the project, we started an archive of properties in the UK that have been devalued by Japanese knotweed and of houses that have witnessed a homicide or suicide because of the panic of depreciating value.
At the Empire Remains shop, we opened the Devaluing Property Real Estate Agency to think about the agency of a plant in challenging the real estate market in a city like London, reducing property value through the agency of a plant.
The Devaluing Property Real Estate Agency replicated the all too familiar aesthetics of Relators' window displays in central London. Hundreds of people stopped by the window to look at our assets. Some engaged with the topic, others ridiculed it, and others became infuriated by the idea of playing with such a serious business and stable pillar of society.
After a half-hour consultation on devaluing property with Japanese knotweed, customers were served the plant that can sink your mortgage ice cream, a recipe that incorporates and embraces knotweed as part of a post-industrial city ecosystem, showing one of the many ways the prolific growth of a plant can be put into use, rather than fighting it with million-dollar pesticide programs.
And today, to celebrate the launch of the book, we'll also get to taste some the plant that can sink your mortgage cocktails.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Shall we change? Yeah.
Wow, that's a very hard act to follow. My gosh. Okay. Well, on a very different note, hello everyone. God, such a full room. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm not going to start the PowerPoint. I'm just chatting while you're fixing. I was sort of surprised to be asked to join the event because I don't have a history of writing about food or working on food, and I just thought, well, I could talk a little bit about the Cuban situation in relationship to food, and pulled this together last night on the plane, just trying to think alongside what was going on in the book. Cuba has the strange misfortune of having been basically colonized 3 times, first by Spain, then by the United States, and then by the Soviet Union. And each colonial experience has affected the relationship to food and the country's capability for self-sustenance. It is no longer, it was a country that could feed itself, and it is no longer a country that can feed itself. I didn't really want to go into the whole sugar industry because I think you guys deal with that period very effectively. Only I will just say that probably the greatest tragedy of the romantic era of the Cuban Revolution, which is to say the first decade, was the failed 10 million ton sugar harvest, in which Fidel tried to take the colonial legacy by the horns and use it to advance the country, and instead bankrupted the country and basically threw the population into a semi-starvation state for several years because all farming was stopped in order to produce all this sugar, and they didn't achieve their goal. So, and that tragic moment is one from which food production in the country has never recovered. But anyway, I just give you, I'm Cuban American. When I was growing up, I didn't really understand why my relatives spoke of nouns with brand names. In other words, soap was el fab, right? And I didn't understand why, and that it took research to understand that it was because of the massive importation in mid-century of American products, so that the refrigerator became el frigidaire, which is frigidaire in Spanish, right? And soap was el fa, and there was no other word for it in the Cuban vocabulary. So the other thing that happens in mid-20th century, which is the high point of American control of the Cuban economy, is the introduction of all sorts of foodstuffs that are supposed to be the solution for living in a tropical climate. Most importantly, sweetened condensed milk, which the first 2 advertisements are designed to make you believe it's better for a baby to have sweetened condensed milk than breast milk. That's this one that the child is saying to the radio mic. I'm telling everybody how, as a proof of my gratitude, that this brand of milk has given me strength, beauty, and health. And the brand is known as Milkmaid. And this one, here's another advertisement for it. And underneath La Lechera, it says, whether it's hot or cold, it's always the best. So the issue here is, in the absence of stable refrigeration, this is your solution. And then Crisco is so that your cakes will not get rancid, meaning don't use butter, use Crisco as the substitute. And this is part of a whole kind of project of that period of having the middle-class Cuban population identify American goods with modernity. So here's a General Electric advertisement about, what is behind, what's behind all that comfort in your house is all these products that from the United States that you have to buy. And the introduction of television in 1950 was a national event presided over by the president of the country, who was basically had signed a contract with RCA, who provided the TVs. So that's the pre-revolutionary moment. I deal more, because I work more on contemporary Cuba, with the myths that foreigners have about revolutionary Cuba's food supply. The assumption that rationing equals democratic distribution of food. No concern in that equation for the production of food, how this rationing system affects the production of food, the storage of food, and the failure to distribute food. 50% of Cuba's food never makes it anywhere. And that's also part of the rationing system. Also, there's this generalized belief that Cuba is self-sufficient because it's a revolutionary country regarding food, and also because it's still a largely agricultural economy, but in reality, 70% of food is imported. Lots of lefties these days think that the organic farming that is currently done in Cuba is because the Cubans want to be, like the rooftop gardeners in Brooklyn and be hipsters, but the reality is that it's just the lack of pesticides. There's no hard currency to import pesticides, so they have no choice other than to engage in organic farming. It's not what farmers like or want. And then the biggest myth of all, which was propagated by basically the directorate in the early years of the revolution, was that all Cuban children get fresh milk every day, a liter of fresh milk. It's never been fresh, and it's not even milk anymore. It's mostly soy at this point. So basically, the revolution in Cuban food in the revolution begins with the introduction in 1962 of food rationing. This is the infamous libreta, or your ration card, which is supposed to guarantee that everybody gets enough food to survive every month. And you go to these dispensaries and they check off your what you're entitled to every time you go. What is less known is that the quantity and diversity of foods offered through the ration book has steadily diminished over the last 40 years. So I'll get to later on what it actually means to, what the food is that you get from that book. The other thing that happens is the appearance of state brands. So advertising, as it was once known, disappears, and instead you get this, the Ministry of Industrial Nourishment, basically, is now the brand name of these food products. You also get the Sovietization of the Cuban diet in the 1970s with the introduction of a lot of mostly canned meats, and then also pickled vegetables, which Cubans had never seen before and had to adapt to. The picture on the bottom is actually not a vintage photograph. It's from a store in Miami. The exiles hate the Cuban government, but they miss the old food. So now there are shops in Florida that import food from Russia, so that those Cubans who grew up in the 70s complaining about the Russian food can go buy it and eat it again. Probably one of the most famous television figures in modern Cuban history is this woman, Nitza Villapol, who had a TV show running for about 40 years. She also has the most famous Cuban cookbook called Cooking in a Minute. And she became very famous because she would get on television every day and explain to people what they could use as substitutes for the foods they didn't have. So to master Cuban cooking in over the last 60 years has been about how to make bread without flour, how to make coffee without coffee, how to do, and that was her job for 40 years, was to teach people how to cook dishes that they wanted to make without the food that they had to make the dish. So food scarcity becomes a way of life in the 1960s, and particularly in the 1970s after that failed sugar harvest. So in 2009, that was a month's ration. These days, the food ration lasts about 10 days if you eat sparingly. And it does not include a lot of fresh foods, bananas and potatoes, sometimes when they're available, okay? This is Cuban imports is on top. So basically, here it says 65. It's probably closer now to 70 in 2018 of the Cuban importation. So this is what hard currency, which is extremely limited, goes to, is to bringing food into the country for the population. And whereas Cuba is known as this tropical paradise that produces rum for everybody, in fact, alcoholic beverages and sugar constitute a very small portion of Cuban exports. They're there on the top right, and the vast majority, more than half of Cuban exports is services, which is basically shipping out doctors to work for basically below minimum wage in foreign countries, and the government profits from this. So these days, there's two ways to get food in Cuba if you live there. One is from your state food dispensary, and that's where you pick up the things that are in your ration card when they're available. And the other is to go to these agromercados, or farmers markets. Some of them are run by the state and some are private, and they have exceedingly high prices. So basically, you would leave with a small bag of food, and that would be your monthly wage in those markets. If you have hard currency, what real current money buys these days, and there's $3 billion in remittances sent now to Cuba every year. So Cubans who do have relatives and friends abroad sending them hard currency can shop in dollar markets. You don't use American dollars, you use a Cuban version of the hard currency, so the government takes a 15% cut off of that money, and that boosts the cost of everything. But this picture on the right is what you could buy with a month's salary if you converted it to hard currency and went to a dollar supermarket. So that's not going to last you very long. And you'll notice that the cereal is called cornflakes, even though it's a local production, to be able to sell it better. So how do Cubans manage this besides remittances? Is making a lot of jokes. During the special period in the 1990s, one of the most popular jokes was about how pizza was made with condoms when they didn't have cheese. And this was from a relatively recent news story about a guy who makes homemade wines and sells them in his town and uses condoms to help with the fertilization process. There are a lot of free condoms in Cuba, so whatever you can get for free, you have to figure out how to use it. Okay, so another question is, who gets what kind of food? There's been a boom in tourism in Cuba from the United States because of Obama's trip there a couple of years ago, and so what you see on the left is what tourists get when they sit down for a meal in a state restaurant or in a privately run restaurant in somebody's house. What you see on the right is what you get if you're in prison, but it's also what you get when you're in school. And I will come back to that in a moment. That is pretty much a soup made with some legume, some bean and rice, and I'm not sure what the thing on the top right is. Food prohibitions. These are not religious prohibitions, these are legal prohibitions. Because the state does profit from the sale of beef and seafood, primarily lobster, it is against the law to engage in any private sale of these foods in Cuba. That doesn't mean that people don't do it, but it is against the law, and it is considered a criminal offense, so you can spend several years in prison if you are caught selling beef or lobster privately. Okay, back to the school lunch. So here's kids with their school lunch, and when they're little, they probably kind of grin and bear it and don't say much about it, but older students have started protesting the food, which is basically the state food. That is the state's version of a proper meal, right? This is revolutionary food. And basically what this student is saying at the art school, the top art school, is she's explaining to the employees who serve the food that she knows that they're not to blame for what the food is, and that they are trying to do their job, but that she, as a student, cannot produce the work assignments that her professor has given her if that is the nourishment that is provided by the revolution. And this started a major food protest, and there were people with cell phones there, and so it went viral, which may not seem unusual to you, but cell phone possession was only legalized in Cuba in 2008, so there was no way to make videos of protests prior to that. time. What do Cubans do with the food trays that have the food that they don't like? This is the better use, is to make television antennas. And there are lots of them, and this is how they watch TV from Miami. It is not a criminal offense, but it is a cause for alarm and bringing the police in if you publicly speak about hunger in Cuba, because the revolution was supposed to have ended hunger. So this is a video that I believe it was made by an amateur in 2013. It went viral, and the man in it, not this man, but the next man who jumps in, who complained about hunger, became a kind of international celebrity for about a week, and then was committed to a mental institution for what he had done. So here he is. This guy's just talking about music in Cuba and whether reggaeton is better than salsa, and he's interrupted by this guy. So he's speaking in slang, basically saying, you know, we're hungry, stop talking about music, we have to talk to the world about how hungry we are. Okay, so the kind of, how to put this, individualized solution to the current problem is to have internet-based services so that Cuban exiles can send food to their families. So here's an ad for this. You can go online and send and orchestrate the delivery of foodstuffs to your relatives' homes. It's extremely expensive, but it is a service that many make use of given the situation, particularly for the elderly who are most acutely affected by this situation, because Cuba is currently, you know, just like any other third world country, a country of haves and have-nots, and the elderly who cannot engage in private enterprise and or prostitution, which is another source of income for a lot of young Cubans, really do depend on help from abroad in order to eat adequately. Okay, that's it. Oh, okay. It's so cold.
Great. So thank you very much, Coco and Natasha. People are smelling the cocktails already. And also Jesse for the introduction. And I think at first it was, very good. Also, as Natasha was saying at the beginning, a big part of the project for us was also thinking of the legacy of the project, or how the book operates as not only as a catalog of the events that happened at the Empire main shop, but really as both as a form of manual, perhaps, and also as an agreement or a proposition for other institutions and individuals to engage with these questions that we have been posing and kind of elaborate on them further in different contexts. And I think this is why it was great to hear also the Cuban context and how it has been evolving throughout the years, because I think this is for us exactly where there are spaces of opening, and where also both with the contributions that Natasha has done at the Empire Men's Shop back in London, and also that Jesse has done for the volume, both of each one of their projects was kind of dealing with the idea of food scarcity and kind of the rejection of certain foods. And in that sense, maybe this is kind of a way to kind of link this conversation already that I think has been happening, and kind of you elaborated on it really well. And maybe perhaps, Natasha, you can start just by discussing a bit this idea of hunger and how it has played out through different forms of empire, and how, again, kind of this idea of neutrality over hunger really has been producing various forms of oppression, and also like spaces that people have to adapt and inhabit in various places.
Yeah, thank you, Coco. Actually, that really helps for me to come to the lecture that I was doing at the Empire Remains shop, which was revolving around what I'm calling the necropolitics of hunger, in relation to a history of famine. So I was departing from the Great Bengal famine in 1943-44. So also how the famine was structured through through British colonization, but also through the financial efforts at supplying for the Second World War, and the way that that India as a colony was exploited to the point that there were nearly a million deaths. And so you have in undivided Bengal this situation where there is heavy censorship on the part of the British against any representation of the famine in literature, in the arts, and so yet there are mainly artists who work for the Communist Party of India, who were the kind of key representatives of that famine, who went from the city into the countryside in order to create reportage on the Bengal famine. And that was what I was presenting at the Empire Remains shop, and it was also part of the Documenta 14 research in order to introduce this context to Germany and to kind of declare, in a sense, that this is a history of the Second World War that has been largely a blind spot.
Yeah, so the work I did for my presentation and in the book looks at the ways that food aid has been rejected. I heard rumors of some cases in the Bengal famine, but no good citations to put down on paper. But the ways that people have rejected food aid in different ways in different contexts because of different sets of preferences and different ideas of disgust, and what is food to eat versus what is not food to eat. And the US military has created their own humanitarian food aid, which they've described as culturally neutral, to make it universally distributable. And I actually, Coco, wanted to ask you, in the Cuban case, like, to what extent, what sort of agency do people have to choose what they're eating? To what extent is there a simple ration that everyone gets the same thing, versus, like, what if you like something more than something else? And what sort?
Too bad, unless you have money. It's all about it's about money, and the average Cuban salary is now the equivalent of about $25 a month. Okay, it doesn't leave you very much at the to buy foods that other than what comes from the state, right? So for those who have access to hard currency, either because they work in tourism or because they have relatives and friends who are sending money from abroad, or because they're involved in some underground economy, whether it is sex tourism or renting out rooms in their homes or whatever, those are the people who have the hard currency, who can go to the stores. But most of the time they don't have a lot, so it's like, I'm going to buy a bar of soap, a bottle of oil, right, and maybe a pound of beef, right, a ground beef to make picadillo, which is the Cuban hash, which is a traditional food, and not much else. If you have connections in the countryside, if you know farmers or have friends who live in the countryside, then you can get more fruit and vegetable that way, but you really have to have money. That's it. It's just about money. And if you don't have money, you really don't eat well at all.
And I mean, I think also in that regard, this brings one of the questions that we were discussing a lot in the shop, the idea of lack of choice and how basically we're kind of discussing this both on a micro level, but then there's kind of the macro scale, the macroeconomic scale of that. And what has been happening in many Caribbean islands is kind of the depletion of the sugar industry, and how basically in the attempt to reinvent it today, sugar, a process that started back in Brazil in the mid-20th century, has been converted into oil, right, into energy. So carbohydrates not only kind of fuel the bodies, but have started to fuel cars and have fueling homes, et cetera, et cetera. And in that sense, kind of one of the tactics, and I think this is kind of where we kind of, it has been coming in many ways, but like what we have been trying to do in the shop is like, how do you kind of start thinking of these like neoliberal agendas and liberal and capitalist agendas and try to circumvent them? So in our case, today in a place like Barbados, every time the prices on a macro scale, every time the prices of oil go up, there is a need for a sustainable alternative, and countries are induced to take sugar and produce bioethanol out of it. But of course, whenever the price of oil drops, no one really cares about sustainable alternatives, and everyone goes and buys oil. And according to that, one of the fountain that Natasha was presenting was giving one or the other in each case. So, and these are kind of, yeah, it's interesting also to think in each one of these cases, like how do we start kind of unpacking these relationships and kind of trying to circumvent these like logics that have been running for decades and centuries in some cases.
Yep. Another problem in Cuba, though, is, they drilled desperately trying to find crude oil and couldn't. But besides that, has been the distribution problem, has been the sort of the centralization of food planning and distribution had a disastrous effect both on farming and the distribution of food. So scarcity isn't just produced by not having hard currency to import food or not having a salary to buy it. It's also about, and this is my memories of like the 80s, you would run because somebody told you that, a truck arrived with potatoes, or a truck arrived with parsley, or a truck arrived with carrots, or a truck arrived with bananas, and you're rushing to get there, to get online, and also in the hopes that it hasn't spoiled, right? But then that's all there is for 2 weeks. So it becomes very difficult to prepare a meal if all you have is parsley, or all you have is potatoes, or all you have is rice, or all you have is lentils. But this is partially a problem of the poor refrigeration and distribution.
I was thinking also maybe to connect to maybe your work, Natasha, in terms of protests and riots and how to contextualize it more a global scene. What kind of alternatives or forms of resistance appear in terms of, I don't know if it has to do more with exposing certain situation or problematic, or like the kind of makeshift antennas that you were showing, but in a more kind of productive way? I don't know if there are new forms of organization that derive from these struggles, or I don't know what kind of systems or speculative scenarios might be happening out of that condition. Either in Cuba or, yeah.
I mean, actually, another example that comes to my mind when you talked about also food riots, because there was the recent project that I was working on was looking at a sort of artistic reading of various legacies of riots, and Ala Yunus created a work that was investigating the history of the bread riots in Egypt in the 70s, right? And the sort of introduction of IMF and World Bank policies that sort of created this economic crisis that then was also politically manipulated in a way that the bread riots erupted. And she was comparing that to more recent forms of protest and sort of also the way that the cultures of protest have changed in recent times, the Arab Spring, and then sort of the question of what is the next form of resistance or building of revolution. But yeah, it really felt as if the bread riots were an important kind of eruption and sort of leading to a system change in a sense, which we still need to think about and not forget within the kind of current environment, just because the forms of revolutionary language have shifted.
So, I mean, the Cuban context, because, you know, to organize some sort of protest like that would just send you right to prison. That in general, the response of the Cuban populace is to resort to illegality. Just, that's it. It's just, okay, if the system doesn't work, the state doesn't work, communist food sucks, you know, revolutionary food is inedible, well, we're just going to break the law and we're going to do things on our own, right?
And
So,
find lobster.
so yeah, we're, you know, I mean, I go and, you know, stay with relatives or with friends, and my welcome meal is always a lobster tail. Okay, and you know, it always comes from some fisherman who has a side business, who has clients, right? And it's just the same way with pirated media, with pirated everything. I mean, basically that is survival now, is to leave your day job and work on the side, right? And whether it's food production or media production or any, it's just illegality is the reaction against a failed state, you know, a state that doesn't provide adequate foodstuffs, and that, and depending on remittances from abroad.
Well, I mean, I think, again, kind of the question of illegality, of course, also comes with what we have been discussing before with the next invasive is native. And again, how would you kind of, I think for us, it was like in the process of, again, making the ice cream, it was like a very interesting process because it's contaminated waste. It's illegal today to cut this plant in the UK, like to spread it. And basically, therefore, the actual act of like cutting Japanese knotweed, in the risk that it would be spreading, you're kind of starting to engage with illegal activities and kind of with gray zones. Yeah, and like how do you start defining these like ambiguous like spaces of operation? Has, I think for us, has been kind of through the work a very important part, right? Like how can you actually start to create an economic incentive to make like Japanese, like to create an industry for Japanese knotweed to be eradicated through ice cream or cocktails or like paper or bio kind of fuel and many other kind of forms of the ways the plants could be put into use.
So I was just also thinking that a kind of complementary project, right, to the knotweed ice cream and the cocktail is what we talked about in the morning of the forager collectives, Lantana stools. And I think that would just be a really interesting project to introduce to the audience here, because what I enjoyed about it was where this invasive species is thought of also quite differently in terms of the history of British colonization, and then sort of within Indian forest law, etc., and how this collective has then decided also to follow this logic of repurposing and readapting that species into a useful product, which is basically the seating on which these within the Empire Remains shop. So if you could,
Well, yeah, that project, it was titled "The Forest Does Not Employ Me Anymore," and we worked with a Bangalore-based collective called The Forager. And there we were looking into these systems of environmentality, also like Agrawal refers to that, in the sense of controlling population by protecting the environment, which happens in many places in the world, not only in India, but I think in India has this very strong legacy from the British Empire in the way they were destroying forests, and to the point that they run the risk of not being productive any longer, and then they realized that they had to start protecting them. But then it had associated to that all these series of forest laws and environmental preservation acts that in a way started displacing people from the forest, which was their way of life, basically. You could not live off the forest anymore. So there, it was a collaboration with the Soliga people in Karnataka, and they, because they have been pushed out of the forest, they cannot use bamboo because of environmental protection. And the only plant they could access is this invasive plant called Lantana camera. And there we developed together a new approach to that material because it has new, like, other properties different from bamboo, because it's more pliable and can adapt it to different shapes. And yeah, it was this prototype of furniture that they can keep on producing. But more than that was the idea of a sort of enterprise run by them to basically deal with these 13 million hectares of forest that have been invaded by the plant that the British brought as an ornamental hedge.
And basically what we tried to do with that project in this basically business we set is to create a project that its sole purpose is to go bankrupt. How would you actually sell enough stools to get rid of 13 million hectares of lantana? Maybe a task that is probably impossible, but really how could we start through that engaging seriously with like forms of bankruptcy as success, as something that we, in a neoliberal economy, we are encountered with all the time as a derivative of the economy, but how we look at bankruptcy as something that is like inherent to our practices, and we start utilizing as an active form of like trading and acting in the world.
I think that the idea of bankruptcy as success is very important. In some ways, it feeds into a lot of the other projects in the book. And I wonder if you guys could speak a bit more about working in these sort of like interstices of neoliberalism to try and take down both neoliberalism and the relics of colonialism, and how those two work together in these projects.
Well, yeah. So I mean,
I was looking for a picture in the meantime.
I think we started. Well, I mean, I think both what we were talking today is about devaluation, right? Like how, again, this idea of like devaluation of property or the acting of like decreasing value of things could be using as an agenda, as an object, as a form of success. Bankruptcy, I think, also the lack of choice that we were discussing before. With the fountain, this idea of like that we cannot anymore or that we are subjected to a lack of choice, that we cannot choose, or the market chooses for us, and how kind of we start playing this macro scale events on the micro scale relationships or interactions. These are kind of some of the kind of immediate examples I think we had, and have been coming again and again. But really also what Natasha said before about the franchise that is wrapping the book. It's like, for us, like when we were doing when we were like researching this idea of the franchise, we were kind of quite surprised to encounter this figure called Mathilda Harper, which basically opened these salons in the late 19th century. The first one was in Rochester, New York, and she basically started to teach women how to manage hair salons. And she would take women that were from low-income backgrounds and basically teach them how to run a business. And kind of the word franchise actually comes from French, where it kind of means to release one from servitude. And kind of this idea then of the franchise later on in the 20th century gets completely morphed into something that kind of separates oneself or creates the space of the namelessness and the placelessness. Like you walk into a McDonald's or like a GNC or an Avis, and everywhere you go, it's exactly the same thing. People talk to you the same language. The surrounding, the architecture, everything is exactly the same. And kind of what we are trying to do with the franchise agreement is exactly to kind of try to think how to take it back to the origin of the franchise, and how kind of to use again this very neoliberal agenda as a way to kind of start to chip in to the structure.
Which I guess is also connecting to some of the ideas that Michel Fer has been also discussing a lot in the sense of this kind of shift from the 19th century to today, from liberalism in the way that work used to be, right? In the factory, you have certain kind of labor that if you were to protest, you stop the factory and then nothing moves on. But today, once we are not employees in many fields and kind of forms of work, it's not about being employee, but being investee. How do you operate within that system? And for us, there was also an interesting shift in some of these more kind of soil-related extraction of value from different territories, like former colonies or kind of post-independence territories. Once the soil becomes exhausted, or once there is tariffs, or there is no such trade anymore, how do some of these territories also have to invent a new economy within independence or so-called independence? And then it's also when the whole offshore financial mechanism appears within that. But another project also I was thinking within that was the project that Fran and Audrey, that work as fraud, did for the Empire Remains shop, which had to do with the idea of commercial extinction as kind of a spontaneous form of conservation almost, right? And they were looking into the brown shrimps, which are these little shrimps that you can find in sandwiches in the UK, are quite popular, have a very long history, but it was also a very cheap and common source of protein for centuries. But once the labor to peel the shrimps exceeds the value of the shrimp, then becomes redundant as an object or as a source of food. And they were tracking all these connections between the shrimps that are fished in the Thames River, in the estuary, and then sent to special economic zones in Tangier, in Morocco, to be peeled because they're cheapest possible and quickest, and then sent back for sandwiches in England. And how basically the fact that the labor to peel it is more expensive than the shrimp itself, in a way led to a commercial extinction of the species. So it's not a natural extinction because they disappear. They haven't disappeared, they're still there. But they're not profitable enough to be fished. So how almost like that idea of commercial extinction could become a sort of salvation for some of these animals.
And on that note, it's perhaps a good time to open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions?
Or complaints.
Heckling?
We also have here the fantastic graphic designers, an endless supply of the book. Also, if you want to meet later. No complaints.
Maybe we can talk over the magic cocktails.
Yeah.
So, well, just to thank again all of the participants of this evening, and also all of the incredible people that contributed to the book, and Gaia Art Foundation that has enabled us to work on the book and kind of give us the time and the space, and all of the people that were part of the project kind of to take their project to the next step. And yeah, there are many books here, and there are contracts to be signed if anyone is up for the adventure. So thank you very much.